Okay, I think we should get this seminar started. So good afternoon, everyone. And again, thanks for joining. My name is Francesco. I will be delivering this short talk today about standardization, soundscape research and practice, methods for data collection and prediction models. The plan for today is that I'll probably be talking for some 40-45 minutes, and then if that's okay for you, we would keep the question time at the very end, the last 15-20 minutes. So in case you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. You can use the chat for further communications with either me or other attendees, but please note I will be reading all those messages at the very end of my talk. So yeah, again, my name is Francesco. I'm a researcher at the University College London, specifically the Institute for Environmental Design and Engineering. I'm an architect by training, but I've been active in soundscape studies for some 10 years now, and I'm currently working on a project, an ERC advanced grant led by Professor Jiang Kang here at UCL about soundscape indices, which is about developing prediction models for soundscape evaluation, which is again quite relevant to the talk we are going to discuss today. So the aim of the talk today is just to give you again an overview about where we are with the standardization process and what are the most relevant methods for data collection and potentially prediction models for design purposes. So just to give you some context, WHO reports state that almost 80 million of EU citizens suffer from unwanted noise, and they are exposed to levels that are considered to be harmful and likely to generate adverse health effects. In the EU member states, the social cost of transportation noise alone is estimated to range between 0.2 and 2% of the gross domestic product from state to state. Of course, environmental noise is usually very high on the list of complaints that citizens file to local authorities. And of course, there are a number of adverse effects for hearing, speech, sleep, and also cardiovascular implications and some more severe health outcome. For this reason, the policy and all the regulatory frameworks are basically pushing for noise reduction levels, more or less. That's the general approach. The quieter the better, just reduce the sound levels. However, reducing sound levels is not always feasible in terms of practical implications, and most importantly, will not necessarily improve quality of life. There are examples of municipalities in the Netherlands, for instance, where basically all noise regulations were being met and still people were complaining and reporting discomfort related to the acoustic dimension. One of the possible reasons for that is that, of course, noise annoyance will only depend on a limited amount on the actual physics of the signal that is creating and generating the disturbance. For this reason, it's been claimed from various sides that there is a need for an alternative approach to how we manage, characterize, and design the acoustic environment, particularly in cities. And this is where the soundscape approach comes into play. So where does the concept come from? I mean, in general, it's rooted in the acoustic ecology and musical theories, but in the late 60s, basically researchers like Richard Murray-Schafer with the World Soundscape Project, or even Michael Southworth, started to question the qualitative aspect of environmental sounds, and whether we should start to make differences between sounds that are unwanted and qualify as noise and disturbance, and sounds that are preferred and could actually support and promote healthy environments. And more general in the urban design discourse, people started to question again whether we should also investigate how city sounds like rather than just look like. If we have a look at this at the scientific literature, and this is a search I've performed a couple of months ago, via the Scopus database, you see that basically these are basically the number of items related to soundscape, urban soundscape in particular, that can be retrieved from the Scopus database. And you see that there is this steady growth in terms of scientific production, and this is basically reflecting the growing interest in the field. And I've highlighted here three milestones, basically, in over the past 20 years, where you could kind of notice some steeper increase in the publication rate about the topic about soundscape studies. And the first one I wanted to mention is the 2002, which saw the publication of the Environmental Noise Directive by the EU Parliament, which is again about management and characterization of acoustic environments. And that's the general framework that was then cascaded into national legislations for the individual member states. And then 2008, so another big step in development. That's when actually the working group of the International Standardization Organization was established about, again, perceptual evaluation of soundscapes. And then again, 2014, that's another notable date, another notable moment in the soundscape studies development history. That's when the European Environmental Agency published the first report about best practices in the identification and designation of quiet areas. And that's a very important thing, because basically the concept itself of quiet areas had been introduced in the 2002 directive, but being a directive, the definition for quiet areas was quite vague in a way that it basically delegated the criteria for identifying quiet areas to member states. Therefore, there was no unique direction to develop this concept further. And in 2014, basically, the EEA was retrospectively looking at what member states had been doing and kind of summarizing the main outcomes of that. So when it comes to soundscape standardization, the situation currently is that there are three documents that are currently published and active, let's say. The first part, which is actually the only full standard, is part 1, and is about definition and conceptual framework. Was published in 2014. So if you remember, 2008 was the establishment of the actual working group. So it took the working group a whole 6 years to just agree on basic definitions and the basic conceptual framework. If you have ever read the standard, the part 1 of the standard, you will know it's a relatively short document, only 6 to 8 pages with basic definitions. But so all this effort reflects that, again, it's a very interdisciplinary field, and a lot had to be agreed in terms of terms and definitions, because the same concepts mean different things in different fields. The next step was basically part 2 about data collection and reporting requirements. And actually a first attempt to pass this document as a full standard failed in the ballot of 2017. And again, this was basically a reflection of different instances and different understandings around what collecting data in soundscape studies mean, and how measuring perception can be actually implemented in the field. So the document was basically sent back to the working group for further amendments, and this basically resulted in the document being published in 2018, but this time as technical specification, so not as a full standard in this case. So this is actually the document that is the reference now. So it's the ISO TS 12913 part 2. And then 1 year later, basically there was the publication of part 3, which is basically about data analysis. So in part 2, you have a number of methods that are recommended for data collection. And then, of course, you gather the data set. And then in part 3, there are some suggested techniques for analysis and how to actually make the connections between the objective and the subjective data that are collected in the context of a soundscape study. A very recent update is that actually the ISO approved a preliminary working item for part 4 of this standard, which will again be published as technical specifications. And the working group has just started activities on this item, and it will be about soundscape design intervention. So the idea here is that basically with part 1, you set the framework. So it's just to set a few rules in order for everyone to be able to understand each other and making sure we speak the same language, basically. In part 2 and 3, you explain how to basically generate soundscape data that is comparable across different locations and different points in time. And then part 4, for the moment, is leaning towards creating, again, a framework for this data to be fed into a broader design process, and also a way to interact with other stakeholders involved in any urban design process, basically. So this should very much be seen as kind of an interface between the soundscape researchers or soundscape consultants or experts, whatever you want to call them, and potential clients. So people actually responsible for implementing changes in the built environments, be that, I don't know, local authorities, officers, or community groups, community action groups, and so on. So this is what this 4th part of the standard is trying to achieve. So starting from the definition, soundscape is basically defined in part 1 as an acoustic environment as perceived and experienced and or understood by a person or people in context. So I've highlighted here a few terms, and basically the most important in my view is perceived. And this clearly makes a difference between soundscape as a perceptual construct and acoustic environment as a physical phenomenon. So this is something that even in scientific literature, people tend to use soundscape as an equivalent for acoustic environment, while if you stick to this definition, it's quite clear that they are quite different things, in a way that you could very well have an acoustic environment without anyone perceiving it. I'm thinking, for example, about acoustic environments in, I don't know, Antarctica or wherever. But then those become soundscapes when you actually put a human listener in context. So that's the main difference between soundscape and acoustic environment. So if you want to see this process as an input-output process, in a way you could see the acoustic environment, the range of stimuli and sound sources propagating sound in the environment as the input. And then you have this kind of black box, which is our perception, and soundscape is actually our perceptual outcome. Another key concept in the standard, in the definition provided by the standard, is context. So context includes the interrelationships between person and activity and place in space and time. So the context may influence soundscape through 1, the auditory sensation, 2, the interpretation of the auditory sensation, and 3, the responses to the acoustic environment. So I think this figure, which is taken again from part 1 of the standard, summarizes this iterative process quite clearly. So you have the context, which is the physical and social space where things are happening with the sound sources. And then you have the people experiencing those, and they respond. And of course, the response itself to the acoustic stimulation could affect, in turn, the context. And I mean, we have very clear example for I don't know, for a room acoustic, like the Lombard effect in terms of speech and people raising the voices and so on. So you see how this is an iterative process. And then, of course, you have the outcomes. So what are these outcomes? Again, in the standard, they are defined as overall long-term consequence facilitated or enabled by the acoustic environment. So this could include attitudes, beliefs, judgment, habits, visitor experience, and other aspects. So I've taken here a table of possible outcomes from a paper by Brown, Yeslan, and Kang, and you see those are potential outcomes from a soundscape experience. So you see, I don't know, clarity, comfort, liveliness, importance, peacefulness, and things like that. So you see that they are very much related to emotion and psychological state and mood. So the level, which is, you know, the DB-driven approach, is not exactly relevant in this context. It's just one side of this story. So when it comes to part two, I have to say the structure, the outline of part two is not very linear in a way. So you kind of have to dig into it to find the elements of interest that can be actually be used in practice. So I've reported here, this is a schematic representation I've generated for the technical specifications for part two. So on the left-hand side, you have the sections, you have scope, normative references, terms and definitions, descriptors and indicators. Those are quite standard. Those are quite common sections in any standard document. And then, in my view, the most interesting sections are, of course, section 5, which is about data collection, and section 6, which is about reporting requirements. And more specifically, these sections are then pointing the readers towards some informative annexes. So again, they are informative, they are not normative as far as it concerns data collection methods for individual data, for subjective data. And then if you read more in detail, Annex C, which is the actual annex for data collection methods, you see that basically there are 3 options proposed. So there is a method A, method B, and method C. And the reason for these 3 protocols being there is, as I said, basically, I mean, in a very rude way, I would say, the working group couldn't find consensus, couldn't reach an agreement on a single method. Therefore, what the standard is doing is basically proposing a range of options in terms of protocols. But what we can do is actually trying to identify where these protocols could be applicable. So method C, for example, section C.3.3 is about interviews, narrative interviews. So there is a recommended protocol for how to conduct an interview about soundscape studies. And what we understand is that those should mostly be conducted offsite. So we are imagining a situation where the researcher is going to residents, to homes, basically, to interview local residents in a specific area where a soundscape study is being conducted, and then performing this kind of in-depth narrative interview. While the more operational tools, let's say those we are mostly used to, are for on-site data collection, and those relate to basically a sound walk, and I'm assuming everyone is more or less familiar with what a sound walk is. And then you have the questionnaire, which is associated to the soundscape, to sound walk, sorry. And then for those, you have 2 methods, and they are equivalent because the standard doesn't really offer any indications on when and why we should use one rather than another. So let's have a look then at these 2 protocols. So this is the first protocol from method A, and you can see that the questions basically relate to a number of categories. So the first things that the protocol is asking the participants to assess are basically sound sources. And you have this 4 categories: traffic noise, other noises, sounds from human beings, natural sounds, and so on. And then the participant of the sound walk is being asked to actually rate the dominance of those sound sources in context, right? So you imagine the group of participants performing the sound walk. People stop at a specific location, they are investigating, they listen to the environment, and then they answer to those questions. So by filling that, you basically get some sort of sound source profile of the place, if you want a sound footprint in a way. And then you have the more emotional, let's say, part of the questionnaire, where you have 8 scales, 8 adjectives, attributes, which are reported below, and these are pleasant, chaotic, vibrant, uneventful, calm, annoying, eventful, and monotonous. And for each of those, basically, the participant is asked to assess the extent to which they agree or not that the sound environment they have just experienced is matching that attribute, that particular scale. And again, this is a 5-point Likert scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And then you have a third section, which is more about general questions and, let's say, holistic experience and perception of the soundscape. And the participant in that case is asked to rate overall how would they describe the present surrounding sound environment as a whole, let's say, ranging again on a 5-point scale from very good to very bad. And then there is another general question, which is about appropriateness. So overall, to what extent is the present sound environment appropriate to the present place? And sometimes people tend to understand this as an equivalent, again, for general quality. But again, appropriateness, it's kind of an orthogonal dimension to pleasantness or any other attribute, because in principle, it should be valence neutral in a way that is neither bad nor good. Because if you're standing by a highway and you hear a lot of traffic noise, that's not necessarily good, but of course you may say that that's appropriate, that's expected. So the appropriateness dimension is more probably related to whether there is a match between the experience and the expectation, or rather the sound environment and the visual context, and things like that. So just a note about the attributes that are coming from the method A. These are not actually independent. They come from this circumplex model proposed by Axelsson and colleagues, who developed the first Swedish soundscape quality protocol. And actually, this is the model that they came up with. Basically, you have to imagine this model for soundscape characterization, where you have two main dimensions, two main components, and the horizontal one is the one about pleasantness. So a soundscape that is pleasant or annoying, so it's the valence thing. So whether soundscape is good or bad, more generally. And then you have an orthogonal dimension, which is about eventfulness. So this should be seen as a neutral dimension. So again, something that is uneventful or uneventful is neither good nor bad. But then when you combine this with the valence dimension, you do get other adjectives. So for example, if a soundscape is assessed as being pleasant and eventful, it will probably be defined as exciting, lively, vibrant, and so on. If a soundscape is both pleasant and uneventful, it will probably be calm, tranquil, restorative, quiet, all these kind of perceptual outcomes. If a soundscape is uneventful and annoying or unpleasant, therefore we are moving to the negative region of this model, then it will be monotonous, boring. And then if you move up the eventful dimension, but stay in the negative region of the model, a soundscape that is both eventful and annoying and unpleasant will be characterized as chaotic, for example. So from this, once again, if we go back to the positive region of this model, where you have lively, exciting, vibrant, and calm, quiet, tranquil, on the other side, you can immediately tell that, again, once again, sound level is only one aspect of this, because the main message here is that if you have a positive soundscape experience outcome, that's not necessarily related to sound levels. So for exciting and lively and vibrant soundscapes that one could experience, I don't know, in a busy commercial district or city center, you don't necessarily expect low sound levels, and yet your soundscape experience is likely to be positive. So going back to the methods of the standard, basically you have the method B, which is asking, again, slightly different questions. And you can see the questions here. So the first one is about loudness, so like perceived magnitude of the stimuli of the acoustic environment. And then, again, there are these scales where people can actually put a mark on. And then other questions about unpleasantness. So some people have said that here, there is a risk of bias because of how the question is phrased, because if you ask people to focus on how unpleasant something is, again, there is a risk that people may overestimate and overestimate negative feelings. And then there is the appropriate concept, which is returning. And then there are some slightly unrelated but related concepts, which are about how often you would like to visit this place again, just to get some kind of proxy about the enjoyment of the space. And then some open-ended questions, unstructured questions, where you have the participants being asked to list the sound sources. So in method A, you had the categories and the profile of dominance. Here, basically, the participant should list the sound sources in descending order, starting from the most noticeable to the least noticeable. And then a general question about what's going through your mind, because again, the purpose here is to get some more unstructured data that could then maybe be run through some kind of thematic analysis procedures to get slightly different, slightly more qualitative set of data. But again, one of the limitations of the standard is that it doesn't tell you whether you should use, even if you're just doing the sound work, it doesn't tell you whether you should go for method A rather than method B. And that's kind of undermine the very concept of standardization, because you know, you should be able to actually give a standard to a practitioner or to a researcher and ask them to go and come back with the data, and that should make it comparable by default. But then what about you know, different groups, different people, different consultants using the two protocols? So this would be a totally legitimate choice. And yet, when it comes to comparing those, we would have some problems. So there has been also some research about, you know, this paper, for example, is about dividing two groups doing the same sound work, with one group doing the method A and the other group using the method B, and basically with some kind of statistical processing, seeing whether the outcomes, the general outcomes, are at least comparable in terms of where a soundscape is positioned on the pleasantness spectrum. So going forward with part 3. So part 3 is very much about again, when you get the data according to the questionnaires from method A or method B. So how do you actually process that, and how do you report that? So for method A, as I said, because the attributes come from a theoretical model, what the part 3 of the standard is doing here is offering you with an analytical formula to actually convert those 8 attributes scores back into like a point onto the circumplex model. So you have this kind of orthogonometric transformation that would basically give you, starting from the scores you have for the 8 attributes, would basically give you 2 coordinates, one for each of the 2 main dimensions, pleasantness and eventfulness, so that you can actually locate a specific soundscape assessment on the model, on this theoretical space. And from my experience, I mean, so of course you can't do that with method B, but you still have recommendations and guidelines on how to report that and what kind of measures of central tendency you should be using for reporting. But in my opinion, I mean, the big advantage of method A is that, especially when you talk with designers, this is a very visual approach. So it's very much it's very useful to be able to place this on a model and actually making comparisons with different solutions and comparing different soundscapes. So you could actually locate them on this map and immediately tell whether a soundscape is more successful than another, coming from a characterization point of view. So after we have discussed this general overview about the standard, so the question is the ISO standard actually enough? And short answer from my side would be no, because it's basically just reflecting a very tiny slice of what's happening out in the world in terms of soundscape studies. So what we did was basically in doing a review of methods that people have been using in the context of soundscape studies for collecting data from people. And when we came to summarize this, so the main thing is that basically, if you consider the acoustic environment, of course, there are different ways of experiencing the acoustic environment in the first place. So, of course, the most obvious one is that we experience the acoustic environment on site, but then you could also have simulated or reproduced acoustic environments, and that's what's happening actually with laboratory studies. So this is what researchers usually do when they are investigating specific aspects. But then, of course, you could also have an acoustic environment that is simply recalled in memory. And that's the example, the situation for, with, I don't know, the narrative interviews that we have discussed that are actually also part of the standard, where, I don't know, as a researcher, you visit a resident to their place and you ask questions about an acoustic environment, about their area, about their neighbor, about their neighborhood, sorry. And of course, they are not experiencing that on site, but they are recalling it in memory, but that's still kind of a soundscape assessment. And then for each of those three main methods of experiencing it, you have different methods and tools. So for example, for soundscapes experience on site, you may have sound walks, which are the things we have just discussed, but also behavioral observation. So you actually observe people, you don't ask questions, you have an observation protocol that will then give you a proxy for how soundscape is being perceived. And then in lab experiments, you tend to work with semantic scales, but recent trends show that, again, researchers are going in the direction of, for example, physiological measurements like heart rate, skin conductivity levels, other kind of physiological indicators. And the reason for that is that we want to establish connections between, again, physiological outcomes and perceptual outcomes and the exposure to specific acoustic environments without the need to actually ask people, because that would by default introduce some bias. So this was just to tell you, just try to keep an open mind when it comes to collecting data. And of course, if you're doing this for consultancy, the ISO is a very good reference, but there is much more out there. So very general question is, why do we need individual soundscape data overall? The answer is that data is helpful, soundscape data is helpful to define descriptors and indicators for the human perception of the acoustic environments. So the next questions are, okay, then what is a soundscape indicator? What is a soundscape descriptor? And are the same thing? And the question we would, because again, these terms, indicators, descriptors, sometimes, especially in environmental acoustics, tend to be used sometimes in an interchangeable way, but in the context of soundscape studies, we thought it was good to make some clarifications. And basically, we understand that indicators and descriptors are two different things. So soundscape descriptors should be seen as measures of how people perceive the acoustic environment. So they are related to the perceptual outcome. So for example, the calmness, the vibrancy thing, the pleasantness thing we have seen before, those are soundscape descriptors because they measure perception on people. On the other hand, soundscape indicators are measures, so basically quantifiable entities that we can use to predict the value of a soundscape indicator. And the very basic example from psychoacoustic is this one where you have the perceived loudness indicated as C in this case, which is, again, a perceptual thing, so something assessed by people, and is predicted by actually this relationship where you have level, which is in this case the indicator, which is the thing, the parameter you can actually measure. So that's the same thing. If we transpose this concept to soundscape studies, we have to find ways of actually predicting perceptual outcomes like calmness and vibrancy and so on, starting from quantifiable measures and parameters. So how do we select soundscape descriptors then? So there are two general recommendations I would like to give to you. So first of all, soundscape concerns how people perceive the acoustic environment. As a consequence, a soundscape descriptor must provide a measure of this aspect, of this perceived aspect. Secondly, a soundscape descriptor in general may either refer to a singular underlying dimension like calmness, vibrancy, and so on, or to soundscape holistically. So it's not rare to actually see things that papers or reports that talk about soundscape quality and how to predict soundscape quality. But soundscape quality as a general term is not necessarily meaningful because, as we said, basically soundscape experience is contextual. So soundscape quality in one context may mean something, in a different context, it will mean something else. So that's why I'm usually skeptical about models that aim for general soundscape quality, like, is this good or bad? And again, if we look at what was published in literature, this is another systematic review that we've carried out last year about types of descriptors that people have been investigating to predict, and the corresponding objective indicators, like objective parameters that have been used in predictive models to predict those descriptors. So you see that there is a wide range of things like tranquility and many more related to calmness. And again, one of the reasons for this, I think, is that basically, again, the environmental noise directive was not very clear about quiet areas and methods to identify those. Therefore, a lot of research went into that direction about how can we predict calmness and tranquility and restorativeness and so on. But there is a whole world of descriptors and attributes out there that people have tried to actually predict, starting from objective measurements. So a very nice example, I like this very much. And again, this is a tranquility prediction tool. It's part of a broader work carried out by Robert Thiessen, Greg Watts, and Kirill Horoshenkov. And here you see this very clearly. So you have in this linear relationship you have on top, you have tranquility, which is again the perceptual thing. And then you have a number of objective indicators to predict tranquility. And in this case, the two main ones are basically level. So level, the equivalent, A-weighted equivalent sound level, which is, of course, the sound-related one. And then you have basically the percentage of green that is visible in the field of view for the user, for the participant. So it's very interesting here because, again, you have a soundscape dimension, soundscape descriptor that is modulated by both acoustic and non-acoustic, as in visual factors. And the very interesting thing here, if you look at the graph, is that you have the level on the X, and then the perceived tranquility on the Y-axis. And then you have this data series are basically representing different degrees of natural features. So you can see very clearly that, for example, if you fix the level at 60 decibel A, basically the tranquility tool, the tranquility score will vary depending on the visual aspect alone. So it's very interesting because considering that in some situations the noise reductions may not be feasible, you can actually you can actually anticipate this and modulate a sound-related feeling based on visual aspects alone. And you could, for example, increase the perceived tranquility fixing at 60 decibels by just changing the visual setting and augmenting the amount of green features in space. So the interesting thing about these things, these kind of relationships and models, is that they become immediately design tools. So these are things that designers and engineers can very easily understand and use and implement in practice. And of course, there are, I will go quickly now, but what I wanted to say here is that, of course, you could do this for other descriptors. And this is just an example from our own research about vibrancy, which is another descriptor that has been underestimated in my view. So can we define, for example, the vibrancy, the soundscape vibrancy of a place using objective indicators? And we did a few tests, and indeed you can predict that based on both, again, acoustic and visual factors. So this is just to say that, again, you can try this and develop more models for different descriptors and soundscape dimensions. So just to summarize, basically, what are the current priorities and challenges for soundscape research? We carried out a number of interviews with early career researchers, asking them about where they think that the soundscape field as a whole will be in the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years, and where they think that research efforts should go next. And actually, we extracted from this set of interviews a number of common themes that were recurring in the transcripts. And the first thing that came up was, again, the academia practice gap. So we have on one side a very active and vibrant, I would say, research environment where people have been playing and experimenting with different concepts in terms of soundscape studies. But then how much of that actually get gets into practice, into everyday practice in urban design and planning and so on? And the answer is that very little for the moment. So one thing to address is probably this academia practice gap, which is mostly a communication issue. And then other aspects are where this framework is actually applicable. Should we conceive that only for outdoor environments, or can we actually transpose this concept to indoor environments? And then other aspects like other multisensory effects, like again, sound and vision. That's probably the most obvious, the one we have showed also with examples of other models. But then what about sound and smell, soundscape and haptic feelings and things like that? So how does the sound domain interact with all of those? And what's the meaning for design purposes? And then, of course, technology will of course is already a big thing in soundscape studies, and we see an increasing number of researchers making use of virtual or augmented reality tools. And again, that's because the underlying idea of the soundscape concept is that that's a multisensory thing, and we should try to provide a holistic assessment of the environment as we experience it. So the take-home message basically is, I would like to summarize these 3 points. In general, soundscape studies are a growing research field, and I think that the body of scientific literature that has been published over the past 2 decades kind of reflects that. An important point is that standardization is in progress, and the process itself has contributed a lot to the development of this discipline, but of course there are more challenges that have to be addressed in the future. And then just the last point is that prediction models and possibly new metrics, new indices will be required for the soundscape approach to actually fill this gap between academia and practice, because if we want designers to understand and to pick up on this concept, they have to see the design potential of this approach. And that's it from my side. And I will stop sharing now. I think I managed to stick to 46 minutes. That's great. And I would, very much start the conversation now and see whether there are any questions from the audience. There is a question. Apologies if I missed this, but would love to see the study you mentioned around noise limits being met in Netherlands, but no significant change to number of complaints. Do you know off the top of your head who did this? Yes, it's a paper. It's actually a position paper published by the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. I think the first author was Tiered Andringa, and the title should be Positioning Soundscape Research or something like that. But I can find the detail of the title if you need that. We have something in the chat. When you're doing simulated reproduce investigations, how do you ensure that you are reproducing the full extent of the context according to the conceptual framework of part 1 of the standard? So that's a great question, and the answer is kind of it's actually very difficult to ensure that. So first thing I would like to highlight, which is again very disappointing from one in some way from my perspective, is that again the soundscape standard doesn't actually recognize anything related to labs. To lab settings, and so the focus is very much about data collection on site. So there is nothing about, for example, recommendations for laboratory studies in soundscape research, and that's quite disappointing in my view. What researchers are trying to do to compensate for that is, of course, the virtual reality things that I've mentioned before. In order to get reliable and, let's say, ecologically valid results from soundscape studies in the lab, what people try to do is that they try to provide an experience, an environmental experience that is as immersive as possible, so that we can kind of claim that that's the closer we could get to the real world experience. But of course, that's a big limitation. And of course, whenever possible, we should try to rely on field work, basically, let's say. I see another question from Mark. What changes are needed to the standard to adapt to other languages and cultures? That's another great question. And yeah, I think, again, my feeling is that the standard kind of falls short on that. I mean, some people may argue that in the definition of context, when you say context, you are actually kind of embedding the cultural aspect, if you wish, in some way. But yeah, again, that's open for discussion. And languages, that's another great point, actually. I mean, for example, when it comes to the adjectives and the attributes that are reported in the SOUNDSCAPE standard, in the SOUNDSCAPE technical specifications part 2, you know, calmness, vibrancy, pleasantness, those are only provided in English. And I think that's a great limitation because, for example, even for the technical specifications about noise annoyance, the working group did provide different translations because, of course, the same word, the same term may be interpreted in very different ways in different languages. So I'm thinking, for example, about, I don't know, calmness. I mean, calmness is still relatively easy, but because that's something that most of us would agree on. But again, does calmness mean the same thing in Western cultures rather than Eastern cultures? How do we translate that? That's a big thing. And that's even more complex when we go to more sophisticated, let's say, dimensions like vibrancy, for instance. I think it's very hard to translate that and to give a unique meaning to that if you try to translate it to different languages. And actually, we currently have a project called, indeed, the SOUNDSCAPE Attributes Translation Project, and we are trying to provide translations for the attributes of method A. And we are facing a number of challenges when it comes, for example, to languages that are character-based, like Chinese. I mean, the working group needed to come up with 3 different words to convey together something that would be closer to the concept of vibrancy. So even the language, even the simple language thing becomes a huge barrier because of all the cultural implications and ramifications. Yep. So we have another question. You discuss your research comparing methods A and B of soundwork assessment methods. Are there similar studies that look at correlation between long-term responses of residents gathered through interviews and that of participants responding through sound walks or lab tests? So to the best of my knowledge, no. So I'm not aware of any of those studies, of any of such studies. But we also have to keep in mind that, again, so the technical specifications, the methods A and B were published only so less than 3 years ago in 2018. So I think it will take a while for that to actually pick up. But I expect more studies looking at these issues in the near future. Yeah. So if anyone wants to, I forgot to mention that, but if anyone wants to actually, yeah, like speak out loud or connect with the webcam and so on, I can actually, maybe you could signal that in the chat and I can actually promote you to panelist status, which I think you need in Zoom webinars to actually connect and share screens. If not, I would probably ask Zoe from UCAN to connect for a moment.
Hello, great webinar.
I I don't know, Zoe, if there are no further questions, I would simply maybe thank all of the attendees for joining us, and you again, and you can for inviting me. And that's it.
No, that's great. Thanks very much. I shall close it now. Just to let everybody know that the webinar will be posted on YouTube if people wish to watch there. But thanks very much, Francesco, for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.